Right now, as you're watching this video, a single American family controls more wealth than the GDP of 180 countries combined. We're talking about $2.1 trillion under direct management. That's more money than the economies of Canada, Russia, and Spain put together. More than what Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates are worth combined, times 4. This family doesn't just own companies, they own entire industries. They don't just influence markets, they control them. But what nobody knows is how they did it. While everyone obsesses over tech billionaires and oil tycoons, this family has been quietly building the most sophisticated wealth machine in human history. They've perfected something that no other dynasty has ever achieved: invisible control. You won't see them on Forbes lists. You won't find their names trending on social media. Most people have never heard of them, yet they control the financial destinies of millions of Americans every single day. The Johnson family of Fidelity Investments doesn't just manage money. They manipulate entire economic sectors. They've weaponized retirement savings, turned mutual funds into political influence machines, and created a shadow banking system that operates completely outside public scrutiny. Here's what's staggering. They control 401k plans for over 35 million Americans. That means they literally hold the retirement security of 1 in every 9 working adults in this country. When they make investment decisions, entire stock markets move. When they shift strategies, governments take notice. This isn't just about being wealthy. This is about controlling the flow of capital itself, about having the power to make or break companies with a single phone call, about influencing presidential elections without ever making a campaign contribution. The Rockefellers built an oil empire. The Rothschilds dominated banking. But the Johnsons, they've done something unprecedented. They've made themselves indispensable to the American economy while remaining completely invisible. This is the story of how one family cracked the code of ultimate financial control. Today, Abigail Johnson sits in a corner office in Boston, quietly managing assets worth more than the annual economic output of most nations. She's worth $25 billion personally. But that's not the real story. The real story is that she controls $4.5 trillion in total assets. She decides where pension funds invest. She influences which companies get funding and which don't. She holds the financial futures of 40 million Americans in her hands. And most people couldn't pick her out of a lineup. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Johnson story begins in 1886 with Edward C. Johnson, a man who couldn't afford college and started his career as a door-to-door insurance salesman in the slums of Boston. He had no connections, no family money, no business education. What he had was something far more dangerous, an obsession with understanding how money really moved. While other families built their fortunes on oil, railroads, or steel, visible, tangible empires, the Johnsons discovered something revolutionary: the power of managing other people's money. They realized that you don't need to own factories or mines to control an economy. You just need to control where the money flows. Edward's son, Edward C. Johnson II, took this insight and turned it into a science. In 1946, he founded Fidelity Investments with a simple but radical premise. Instead of managing money for wealthy elites, he'd democratize investing by creating mutual funds for ordinary Americans. What nobody understood at the time was that this democratization was actually the most sophisticated wealth concentration scheme ever devised. By the 1960s, Fidelity wasn't just managing investments, they were shaping them. When Ned Johnson III took control in 1977, he transformed the company from a mutual fund manager into something unprecedented: a financial puppet master. He didn't just react to markets, he created them. But here's what makes the Johnson Empire different from every other American dynasty: invisibility by design. The Kennedys sought political power and got it, along with constant scrutiny. The Walmart Waltons accumulated retail dominance and became household names. The Johnsons chose a different path entirely. They embedded themselves so deeply into the American financial system that removing them would cause economic collapse. They made themselves not just wealthy, but essential. Your retirement fund? Probably managed by Fidelity. Your 401k? Likely invested through their platforms. Your mutual funds? Odds are they flow through Johnson-controlled channels. What most people don't realize is that modern America runs on a hidden financial infrastructure, and the Johnsons control the most critical components. They're not just participants in the economy, they are the economy. This wasn't just about building wealth. This was about engineering dependency, about creating a system where millions of Americans would literally trust the Johnsons with their financial futures without even knowing their names. Behind the Johnson Empire was a three-generation plan that makes Machiavelli look like an amateur. Edward I understood money flow, Edward II understood scale, Edward III understood power. And Abigail? She understands something her predecessors could never have imagined: how to control a digital economy. Today's Fidelity doesn't just manage traditional investments. They control cryptocurrency exchanges, dominate robo-advisor platforms, and have positioned themselves at the center of every major financial innovation of the past decade. They're not just adapting to the future, they're programming it. The numbers tell the story. In 1946, Fidelity managed $13 million. Today, that number has grown to $4.5 trillion. That's not just growth, that's conquest. They've achieved something no empire in history has ever accomplished. Control without ownership, power without visibility, dominance without accountability. Let me put this in perspective. Apple, the most valuable company on earth, is worth about $3 trillion. The Johnsons control more assets than Apple is worth. They manage more money than the GDP of every country except the United States, China, and Japan. They have more influence over American retirement security than Social Security itself. This is the story of how one family didn't just get rich, they made themselves indispensable. How they turned financial services from a business into a form of soft governmental control. How they've positioned themselves as the invisible bridge between every American and their financial future. But to understand how the Johnsons achieved this unprecedented level of control, we need to go back to 1886, to a small apartment in Boston, where a door-to-door insurance salesman named Edward Johnson was about to discover something that would reshape American capitalism forever. Chapter 1. Humble Beginnings. Edward C. Johnson had holes in his shoes and $47 to his name when he made the discovery that would eventually create a financial empire worth trillions. The year was 1886. While the Rockefellers were consolidating oil and the Carnegies were building steel empires, 22-year-old Edward was trudging through the muddy streets of Boston's poorest neighborhoods, carrying a leather satchel full of life insurance policies that nobody wanted to buy. He'd been fired from 3 jobs that year. His formal education had ended at 16 when his family ran out of money. Most nights he ate bread and water for dinner in a cramped boarding house room that smelled like cabbage and defeat. By every measure, Edward Johnson was a failure. But Edward had something that separated him from every other struggling insurance salesman in Boston: an obsessive need to understand why money moved the way it did. While other salesmen focused on closing deals, Edward spent his evenings in the Boston Public Library, studying financial newspapers and investment patterns. He noticed something that nobody else seemed to see. The people who got rich weren't the ones who worked the hardest. They were the ones who understood where money was flowing before anyone else did. You see, in 1886, most Americans kept their savings under mattresses or in basic bank accounts, earning minimal interest. The stock market was a rich man's game, accessible only to those with substantial capital and insider connections. Investment advice came from a small circle of wealthy bankers who shared information only among themselves. Edward realized that information was the real currency. Not gold, not stocks, not bonds, information. Specifically, information about where smart money was moving and why. His breakthrough moment came on a rainy Tuesday in November. Edward was trying to sell a life insurance policy to a wealthy widow named Mrs. Catherine Phillips, who owned several properties in Beacon Hill. Instead of giving him her standard rejection, she invited him inside for tea. "Young man," she said, "I don't need life insurance, but I do need someone who understands money to help me with my investments. My late husband left me well provided for, but I have no idea what to do with it." This conversation changed everything. Mrs. Phillips had $15,000 in various banks, more money than Edward had ever seen. But she was earning less than 3% annually in interest while inflation was running at 4%. She was slowly going broke despite having substantial wealth. Edward spent the next 3 weeks studying her situation. He discovered that by moving her money into a diversified portfolio of railroad bonds and industrial stocks, she could earn 8 to 10% annually while actually reducing her risk. The key was spreading investments across multiple companies and industries, something wealthy families did naturally, but ordinary investors never learned. When Edward presented his analysis, Mrs. Phillips was amazed, not just by the potential returns, but by how clearly he explained everything. Most financial advisors spoke in jargon and kept their methods secret. Edward made complex investments understandable. Within 6 months, Mrs. Phillips had earned more from her investments than she had in the previous 2 years combined. More importantly for Edward, she introduced him to 12 other wealthy widows and retired businessmen who needed similar help. Edward had discovered the foundation of the Johnson Empire. There was enormous demand for honest, transparent investment advice among people who had money but lacked financial expertise. By 1888, Edward had left insurance sales entirely. He opened Edward C. Johnson & Company, a small investment advisory firm operating out of a single room above a bakery on State Street. His approach was revolutionary for its simplicity: charge reasonable fees for honest advice, diversify investments to reduce risk, and explain everything in plain English. But Edward understood something deeper. He wasn't just managing money, he was managing trust. Every client who earned solid returns told friends and family. Every successful investment created referrals. Edward was building something more valuable than a business. He was building a reputation for making ordinary people wealthy. The secret was patience and compound growth. While other investment advisors chased quick profits and high-risk speculation, Edward focused on steady, long-term gains. He studied companies that provided essential services, railroads, utilities, basic manufacturing, and invested when they were undervalued and unloved. This strategy paid off dramatically during the Panic of 1893. While speculative investors lost fortunes, Edward's clients saw minimal losses and actually bought more shares at reduced prices. When the economy recovered, they were positioned for massive gains. Here's what's fascinating. Edward kept detailed records of every investment decision and its reasoning. He was building an investment methodology that could be taught and replicated. This wasn't just intuition. This was a systematic approach to wealth building. By 1895, Edward C. Johnson & Company was managing over $200,000 for 47 clients. Edward had proven that ordinary people could build substantial wealth through smart, patient investing. But more importantly, he had proven that managing other people's money could be more profitable than trying to get rich alone. Edward's personal breakthrough came when he realized that his own wealth was growing faster than his clients' wealth, not because he was cheating them, but because his management fees were compounding along with their investments. The more money he managed, the richer he became. The richer he became, the more money people trusted him to manage. This was the birth of the Johnson formula. Make your clients wealthy, and you'll become wealthier. Build trust systematically, and money will flow to you naturally. Focus on long-term relationships, not short-term profits. But Edward understood that his personal success was limited by his own capacity to serve clients. To build real wealth, he needed to scale beyond what one person could manage. He needed to create systems and hire people who could implement his methodology. In 1899, Edward made his first key hire, his younger brother William, who had been working as a bank clerk. Together, they refined Edward's investment approach into a written system that could be taught to other advisors. By 1900, Edward C. Johnson & Company was managing $500,000 and had established something unprecedented, a replicable system for creating wealth through patient, diversified investing. Edward had cracked the code that would eventually allow the Johnson family to control trillions. The foundation was set. Edward had proven that managing money could be more profitable than making money. He had built a sustainable system based on trust and results, and he had begun training the next generation to think even bigger. But Edward's real genius wasn't in what he had accomplished, It was in what he was teaching his son, Edward C. Johnson II, the boy who would transform his father's small advisory firm into the most powerful financial institution in American history. Chapter 2: Secret Formula. Edward C. Johnson II was 12 years old when his father showed him the ledger that would change everything. It was 1910, and the family was gathered around the dinner table in their modest Brookline home. Edward Sr. had just finished reviewing the monthly performance reports for Johnson & Company's 127 clients. Instead of celebrating another profitable month, he looked troubled. "Son," he said to young Ned, "I want you to understand something important about money." He opened the leather-bound ledger and pointed to a column of numbers. "See this? We're managing $800,000 for our clients. They're earning an average of 9% annually. That's $72,000 in profits for them each year." Then he flipped to another page. "And here's what we earn. 1.5% management fees on $800,000. That's $12,000 annually for us." Young Ned studied the numbers carefully. Even at 12, he was exceptionally bright with mathematics. "Father, our clients are making 6 times more than we are from their own money." Edward Sr. smiled grimly. "Exactly, and that's the problem we need to solve." This conversation planted the seed of what would become the Johnson Empire's secret formula. While Edward Sr. had built a successful advisory business, Ned would engineer something far more sophisticated, a system where the Johnsons would eventually earn more from managing money than their clients earned from owning it. The solution required thinking differently about the entire financial services industry. Instead of just managing wealthy individuals' portfolios, what if they could pool money from thousands of smaller investors? Instead of earning fees from a few hundred clients, what if they could earn fees from hundreds of thousands? Ned spent his teenage years studying this problem obsessively. He read every financial publication he could find. He analyzed the fee structures of banks, insurance companies, and investment trusts. He calculated how much money ordinary Americans saved and where they kept it. What he discovered was staggering. Millions of Americans had small amounts of savings sitting in low-interest bank accounts, earning 2–3% annually, while inflation ate away their purchasing power. They wanted better returns but couldn't afford the minimum investments required by most advisory firms. The mathematical potential was enormous. If Johnson & Company could create a way to pool these small investments together, they could manage millions of dollars while serving people who would never qualify for traditional investment services. But there was a fundamental problem. Existing investment trusts were designed for wealthy investors and required substantial minimum investments. What Ned envisioned would need to be accessible to ordinary working Americans, people with $50 or $100 to invest, not $5,000 or $10,000. Ned's breakthrough came during his junior year at Harvard in 1917. He was studying corporate law when he discovered something fascinating: mutual ownership structures used by some insurance companies. Instead of being owned by stockholders, these companies were owned by their policyholders. Profits were shared among all participants based on their level of participation. What if this structure could be applied to investments? What if small investors could pool their money together, own shares of the pooled fund proportional to their investment, and benefit from professional management that was previously available only to the wealthy? This was the birth of the modern mutual fund concept and the foundation of Johnson financial dominance. Ned spent months working out the mathematics. A fund with 1,000 investors averaging $500 each would control $500,000, enough to implement sophisticated diversification strategies. Management fees of just 1% would generate $5,000 annually. But if they could scale to 10,000 investors or 100,000 investors, the numbers were intoxicating. Traditional investment advisory firms were limited by the number of wealthy clients they could serve personally. But mutual funds could theoretically serve unlimited numbers of small investors through a single pooled structure. More importantly, Ned realized that mutual fund investors would be more loyal than traditional advisory clients. Wealthy individuals could easily move their money between advisors, but ordinary Americans investing for retirement or long-term goals would likely stay invested for decades, generating steady fee income for years. World War I provided Ned with his first real-world testing ground. When he graduated from Harvard in 1918, he convinced his father to experiment with pooled investments using money from their existing clients who wanted to invest in war bonds but lacked the knowledge to evaluate different options. Johnson & Company created their first informal mutual fund, the Liberty Bond Trust. They pooled $50,000 from 20 clients, used professional analysis to select the best government bonds, and shared the returns proportionally. The experiment was incredibly successful. Clients earned higher returns than they could have achieved individually, and the Johnsons earned management fees from the entire pool. But Ned understood that this was just the beginning. The real opportunity would come after the war, when millions of Americans would have savings to invest, but no access to professional investment management. Throughout the 1920s, Ned refined his mutual fund concept while working alongside his father. They tested different fee structures, explored various investment strategies, and built relationships with brokerage firms that could help distribute fund shares to small investors. The key insight was that success would require scale and standardization. Instead of managing individual portfolios, they needed to create investment products that could be sold like any other consumer product. Instead of serving clients one at a time, they needed systems that could serve thousands simultaneously. Ned developed what he called the Johnson formula. Create superior investment products, make them accessible to ordinary Americans, charge reasonable fees, and focus obsessively on long-term performance. If they could execute this strategy successfully, the mathematical potential was unlimited. By 1929, Ned had convinced his father to commit fully to mutual funds. Johnson & Company launched the Fidelity Fund with $100,000 in initial capital and aggressive plans for growth. Their timing seemed perfect. The stock market was booming, and Americans had more disposable income to invest than ever before. Then October 1929 happened. The stock market crash destroyed most investment firms and wiped out millions of individual investors. But for the Johnsons, the crash provided something unexpected: validation of their mutual fund strategy and an enormous opportunity. While individual investors panicked and sold at massive losses, Ned's mutual fund structure allowed for patient, disciplined investing through the crisis. The Fidelity Fund lost money like everyone else, but professional management and diversification limited the damage. More importantly, Ned had the discipline to buy high-quality stocks at crash prices. When the market eventually recovered, Fidelity Fund investors didn't just recoup their losses, they achieved spectacular gains. Word spread quickly through Boston's financial community. The Johnsons had discovered something remarkable. But Ned understood that surviving the crash was just the first test. The real opportunity was in the economic recovery that would follow. Millions of Americans had lost money in individual stock speculation and would be seeking safer, professionally managed investment options. The 1930s would be the decade when Ned transformed his father's small advisory firm into something unprecedented: a mutual fund company designed to serve ordinary Americans while generating extraordinary profits for the Johnson family. The secret formula was complete. Now came the hard part: execution on a scale that had never been attempted in American financial history. Chapter 3: Hidden Empire. In 1943, while America was fighting World War II, Ned Johnson was quietly engineering a financial revolution from a modest office building in downtown Boston. The war had created an unexpected opportunity. Millions of Americans were earning steady wages from defense work, but had limited options for spending or investing their money. Consumer goods were rationed, travel was restricted, and people were accumulating savings at unprecedented rates. Ned realized this was the moment to scale his mutual fund concept beyond anything previously imagined. But he faced a fundamental challenge. Most Americans had never heard of mutual funds, and those who had considered them risky investments for wealthy speculators. The solution required a complete reimagining of how investment products were marketed and sold. Instead of targeting wealthy investors through traditional brokerage channels, Ned decided to reach ordinary Americans directly through mass marketing, something unheard of in the conservative investment industry. Working with a small advertising agency, Ned created the first nationwide marketing campaign for mutual funds. The message was revolutionary: you don't need to be wealthy to invest like the wealthy. The campaign featured real Americans, factory workers, teachers, shop owners, who had built substantial savings through systematic mutual fund investing. But marketing was only part of the strategy. Ned understood that success required infrastructure that could handle thousands of small investors efficiently. He invested heavily in what we would now recognize as early customer service and administrative systems. Johnson & Company hired teams of clerks who processed investment applications, calculated share values, and mailed quarterly reports to fund holders. They created standardized procedures for everything from opening accounts to handling withdrawals. Most importantly, they built telephone systems that allowed investors to check their account values and make transactions by phone. This infrastructure investment was expensive and seemed excessive to many industry observers. Traditional investment firms served dozens of wealthy clients with minimal overhead. Ned was building systems to serve thousands of middle-class investors, each generating much smaller fee revenues. But the mathematics were working exactly as Ned had calculated. By 1945, Fidelity was managing $10 million across 3 different mutual funds with over 2,000 individual investors. Annual management fees were generating $100,000 in revenue, 10 times what the firm had earned from traditional advisory services just 5 years earlier. More importantly, the business was becoming self-reinforcing. Satisfied investors told friends and family members. Local newspapers wrote stories about ordinary people achieving financial success through mutual fund investing. Each success story generated new investors, which generated more fees, which funded better marketing and service. Ned had discovered what would become the Johnson Empire's greatest weapon: compound growth powered by middle-class trust. The post-war economic boom provided the perfect environment for scaling. Returning veterans had savings from military service and steady employment in the booming economy. Young families were buying homes and needed long-term investment strategies. The emerging American middle class had disposable income but lacked investment expertise. Fidelity positioned itself as the solution to this massive market opportunity. They launched specialized funds for different investment goals: growth funds for young investors, income funds for retirees, balanced funds for conservative savers. Each fund was professionally managed, using sophisticated strategies previously available only to institutional investors. But Ned's real breakthrough came when he realized that mutual funds could serve corporate America as well as individual investors. Companies were establishing pension plans for employees, but lacked the expertise to manage pension investments effectively. What if Fidelity could manage corporate pension assets using the same pooled fund structures? This insight led to the creation of Fidelity's Institutional Services Division in 1947. Instead of selling mutual fund shares to individuals, they sold professional investment management services to corporations, unions, and government entities. The fee structures were different, but the underlying concept was identical: pool assets for professional management and earn fees based on total assets managed. Corporate pension management proved extraordinarily lucrative. A single large corporation might have pension assets worth millions of dollars, equivalent to thousands of individual mutual fund investors. Better yet, corporate pension assets were typically managed for decades without interruption, providing stable long-term fee income. By 1950, Fidelity was managing $50 million in total assets across individual mutual funds and corporate pension accounts. Annual revenues had grown to $500,000, making the firm one of the largest investment management companies in New England. But Ned understood that this was still small scale compared to the ultimate potential. Post-war America was experiencing unprecedented economic growth. The middle class was expanding rapidly. Corporate pension plans were becoming standard employee benefits. The total addressable market for professional investment management was growing exponentially. The challenge was building organizational capacity to capture this growth without sacrificing investment performance or customer service quality. Ned began recruiting talented investment analysts and portfolio managers, offering them partnership opportunities in exchange for growing specific fund assets. This partnership structure created powerful incentives for performance while maintaining family control of the overall enterprise. Portfolio managers earned substantial compensation when their funds performed well, but the Johnson family retained ownership of the management company and all fee revenues. Ned also began investing in technology infrastructure that would allow Fidelity to scale beyond traditional limitations. He purchased early computer systems for calculating fund share prices and processing transactions. He established regional sales offices to serve investors outside New England. He created training programs for financial advisors who would sell Fidelity products through brokerage firms nationwide. By 1955, Fidelity was managing $200 million in assets and serving over 15,000 individual investors, plus dozens of corporate pension plans. The firm employed over 100 people and operated offices in Boston, New York, and Chicago. But the numbers only told part of the story. Ned had accomplished something unprecedented in American finance. He had created a scalable system for democratizing professional investment management while concentrating fee revenues in a single-family enterprise. The hidden empire was taking shape. While most Americans focused on obvious wealth creators, oil companies, manufacturing corporations, real estate developers, the Johnsons were quietly building control over the flow of American savings and investment capital. Every paycheck contribution to a company pension plan, every individual purchase of mutual fund shares, every corporate decision to outsource investment management to professional firms, all of these trends were flowing money and control toward Fidelity and the Johnson family. Ned understood that he was creating something more than a successful business. He was building infrastructure that would become essential to American capitalism. Companies would depend on Fidelity to manage employee retirement security. Individuals would trust Fidelity with their life savings. Investment markets would rely on Fidelity as a stable, long-term source of capital. The more essential Fidelity became, the more protected and profitable the Johnson empire would be. But Ned knew that achieving true dominance would require something even more sophisticated than what he had built so far. The next phase would require extending Fidelity's reach beyond investment management into every aspect of American financial services. The goal wasn't just to manage money, it was to control how money moved through the entire economy. Chapter 4: Silent Takeover. By 1965, Ned Johnson had achieved something remarkable. Fidelity was managing $3 billion in assets and had become one of the largest mutual fund companies in America. But Ned wasn't satisfied with success. He was planning a complete transformation of American finance. The opportunity came from an unexpected source: the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, federal legislation designed to protect worker pension benefits. While most business leaders saw ERISA as burdensome regulation, Ned recognized it as the greatest wealth concentration opportunity in American history. ERISA required corporations to manage pension plans according to strict fiduciary standards and professional investment practices. Small companies could no longer handle pension investments through local banks or amateur management. They needed professional asset managers with proven expertise and regulatory compliance capabilities. Ned realized that ERISA would essentially force American corporations to outsource pension management to firms like Fidelity. But the scale of this mandatory outsourcing was staggering. Corporate America held over $200 billion in pension assets that would need professional management. This wasn't just an opportunity to grow Fidelity's business. It was an opportunity to capture control over American workers' retirement security. Whoever controlled corporate pension investments would influence how hundreds of billions of dollars moved through financial markets. Ned began preparing for ERISA implementation years before the law took effect. He hired teams of lawyers and compliance specialists to understand every regulatory requirement. He built computer systems capable of tracking and reporting on massive pension portfolios. He established sales teams specifically trained to work with corporate benefits managers. Most importantly, he developed investment strategies specifically designed for pension fund requirements: long-term growth to match retirement timelines, diversification to minimize risk, and transparent reporting to satisfy fiduciary obligations. When ERISA took effect in 1974, Fidelity was ready. While competitors scrambled to understand new regulations and build compliance capabilities, Fidelity was already marketing comprehensive pension management services to corporate America. The results were spectacular. Between 1974 and 1980, Fidelity's pension management assets grew from $1 billion to over $10 billion. Corporate clients ranged from small manufacturing companies to Fortune 500 corporations. Each new pension client generated substantial annual fees and typically remained with Fidelity for decades. But Ned understood that pension management was just one component of a larger strategy. To achieve true financial dominance, Fidelity needed to control multiple touchpoints in Americans' financial lives: retirement savings, personal investing, banking services, and even day-to-day transactions. In 1976, Fidelity launched something unprecedented: comprehensive financial services for individual consumers. Instead of just selling mutual funds, Fidelity offered checking accounts, credit cards, financial planning services, and investment advice through a single integrated platform. This one-stop financial services approach was revolutionary. Traditional financial institutions specialized in specific products. Banks handled deposits and loans, brokerages managed investments, insurance companies sold policies. Fidelity was attempting to replace this entire ecosystem with unified services under Johnson family control. The integration provided enormous competitive advantages. Customers who used Fidelity for checking accounts were more likely to invest in Fidelity mutual funds. Pension plan participants became individual Fidelity customers when they changed jobs. Credit card users received targeted marketing for investment products. More importantly, integrated services generated comprehensive data about customers' complete financial situations. Fidelity knew their income, spending patterns, investment goals, and risk tolerance. This information enabled sophisticated marketing and product development that competitors couldn't match. By 1980, Fidelity was managing $25 billion in total assets and serving over 2 million individual customers, plus thousands of corporate pension plans. Annual revenues exceeded $200 million, making the Johnson family one of the wealthiest in America. But Ned's real breakthrough came when he realized that Fidelity's scale gave them unprecedented influence over financial markets themselves. When Fidelity bought or sold large positions, stock prices moved. When they shifted asset allocation strategies, entire market sectors responded. This market influence created opportunities for what economists call front-running, using advanced knowledge of Fidelity's trading intentions to generate profits in personal accounts. While illegal when done explicitly, the boundaries were murky when the same people making investment decisions for funds also managed personal portfolios. Ned was careful to avoid obvious conflicts of interest, but he understood that Fidelity's market influence created subtle advantages that could be leveraged legally. Superior information, earlier access to investment opportunities, and relationships with corporate executives all translated to better investment performance. Better investment performance attracted more assets under management. More assets generated more fees. Higher fees funded better research and technology. Superior capabilities attracted larger clients and higher fee structures. The Johnson empire was becoming self-reinforcing at multiple levels. Success generated the resources to achieve greater success. Scale provided advantages that smaller competitors couldn't match. Market influence created opportunities that weren't available to ordinary investors. But perhaps most importantly, Fidelity was becoming essential infrastructure for American capitalism. Corporations depended on Fidelity for pension management. Individual Americans trusted Fidelity with retirement security. Financial markets relied on Fidelity as a stable source of investment capital. By the early 1980s, removing Fidelity from the American financial system would have caused massive disruption. Corporate pension plans would lose professional management. Millions of Americans would lose convenient access to mutual fund investing. Market liquidity would decline without Fidelity's large-scale trading activity. Ned had achieved something unprecedented. He had made the Johnson family indispensable to American economic function while maintaining private ownership and control of the wealth generation mechanism. The silent takeover was nearly complete. While Americans celebrated entrepreneurial success stories like Apple and Microsoft, the Johnsons had quietly captured control over the flow of American savings and investment capital. But Ned understood that maintaining this control would require adapting to new challenges and opportunities. Technology was beginning to transform financial services. Regulatory changes were creating new competitive threats. International markets were becoming increasingly important. The next phase of the Johnson empire would require something even more sophisticated than what Ned had built. A truly global financial services platform capable of adapting to any economic or technological change while maintaining family control over trillions of dollars in assets. Chapter 5. Political Control. In 1981, Ned Johnson III made a phone call that would transform American politics forever. He wasn't calling a politician or lobbyist. He was calling his daughter Abigail at Harvard Business School. "Abby," he said, "I need you to understand something about power." Abigail was 19 years old and studying finance, planning to join Fidelity after graduation. She expected her father to discuss investment strategies or business expansion plans. Instead, he explained something that would reshape her understanding of how America actually worked. "We manage pension money for 15 million Americans," Ned said. "That means we control how their retirement savings are invested. When we buy stocks, companies prosper. When we sell, they suffer. Politicians understand this. They call me more often than I call them." Abigail was intrigued but confused. "Father, are you saying we influence politics through our investment decisions?" Ned's response revealed the sophisticated political strategy that had been developing since Fidelity's early pension management success. "We don't need to buy politicians, Abby. We control something more valuable than campaign contributions. We control economic outcomes." This conversation introduced Abigail to what would become the Johnson family's most powerful and controversial capability, wielding enormous political influence without ever appearing to engage in politics. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. Fidelity managed pension assets for millions of American workers, employed by thousands of companies across every congressional district. When Fidelity made investment decisions, they affected employment, corporate profits, and local economic health in politically significant ways. Politicians understood this dynamic instinctively. A senator whose state included major employers with Fidelity-managed pension plans would think carefully before supporting legislation that might cause Fidelity to reduce investments in those companies. But the influence operated more subtly than direct economic threats. Ned had spent years building relationships with corporate executives, pension fund trustees, and government officials. These relationships were based on mutual benefit and shared interests, not explicit quid pro quo arrangements. When tax legislation affecting retirement savings came before Congress, Ned's opinion carried enormous weight because he managed more retirement assets than any other individual. When regulators considered new rules for mutual funds, Fidelity's compliance expertise made their input invaluable. The beauty of this influence system was its apparent legitimacy. Ned wasn't lobbying for special favors or personal benefits. He was advocating for policies that would benefit millions of Fidelity customers and American retirement security generally. Throughout the 1980s, Ned used this influence to shape financial services regulation in ways that consolidated Fidelity's competitive advantages. When Congress debated 401k regulations, Fidelity's recommendations became policy. When banking laws were modernized, Fidelity's integrated services model was protected from competitive threats. But Ned's real political masterstroke came with the development of Fidelity's voter education programs. Starting in 1984, Fidelity began providing investment-related voting guides to their customers during election cycles. These guides appeared completely neutral and educational. They explained how different candidates' policy positions might affect retirement investing, tax-advantaged accounts, and financial market stability. No candidate endorsements were made, and multiple viewpoints were presented. However, the guides were sophisticated political influence tools disguised as investor education. By framing political issues in terms of their investment implications, Fidelity was teaching millions of Americans to vote based on policies that would benefit Fidelity's business model. Candidates who supported expanding 401k contribution limits received favorable coverage in sections about retirement security. Politicians who advocated higher capital gains taxes were criticized in discussions of investment returns. Financial services deregulation was consistently presented as beneficial for ordinary investors. The voter education guides reached over 3 million Americans during each election cycle, more than most political campaigns could afford to contact. More importantly, these Americans trusted Fidelity with their life savings and viewed the guides as objective financial advice rather than political advocacy. By 1988, Fidelity's political influence had become systematic and largely invisible. They were shaping legislation, regulatory policy, and voter behavior without maintaining any official lobbying presence or making political contributions. But Abigail, who had joined Fidelity in 1988 after completing her MBA, understood that this influence system could be expanded far beyond retirement and investment policy. As Fidelity's assets under management approached $100 billion, they wielded influence over corporate governance that could reshape entire industries. When Fidelity bought large stakes in companies, which they did constantly through mutual fund investments, they received voting rights on corporate boards and shareholder resolutions. With $100 billion in assets, Fidelity often became the largest or second largest shareholder in major corporations. This shareholding position gave the Johnsons unprecedented influence over corporate America. CEOs would take their calls immediately. Board decisions considered Fidelity's preferences carefully. Strategic initiatives that might affect Fidelity's investment returns received special attention. Abigail realized that this corporate influence could be leveraged for broader political purposes. When companies made hiring decisions, expansion plans, or facility location choices, they could be encouraged to consider the political implications of supporting or opposing politicians friendly to Fidelity's interests. A subtle suggestion from Fidelity that a company's expansion plans might perform better in states with favorable regulatory environments could influence billions of dollars in capital allocation. Corporate executives who understood this dynamic became allies in Fidelity's broader political influence operations. By 1990, the Johnson family had built something unprecedented in American politics: systematic influence over economic policy, voter education, and corporate governance without any visible political engagement or accountability. Politicians courted Fidelity's favor not through quid pro quo arrangements, but by supporting policies that would strengthen American financial markets and retirement security, policies that happened to benefit Fidelity enormously. Millions of Americans voted based partly on Fidelity's educational materials, believing they were making informed financial decisions rather than supporting Johnson family political preferences. Corporate executives allocated capital and made business decisions with careful consideration of how those choices might affect their relationships with Fidelity as a major shareholder. The political control system was invisible, legal, and incredibly effective. But Abigail understood that maintaining this influence would require adapting to changing political and technological environments. The 1990s would bring new challenges: increasing media scrutiny of financial services companies, more sophisticated regulatory oversight, and growing public awareness of conflicts of interest in investment management. But these challenges would also provide opportunities to expand Johnson family influence into new areas: international markets, technology platforms, and the emerging digital economy. The foundation of political control was established. Now came the more complex challenge of globalizing that control while maintaining the appearance of neutral financial services. Chapter 6: Global Expansion. On March 15, 1995, Abigail Johnson stood in the trading room of Fidelity's new London office, watching numbers scroll across dozens of computer screens. European markets were opening, Asian markets were closing, and American markets would begin trading in 6 hours. For the first time in Fidelity's history, they were managing money around the clock. Abigail had convinced her father that global expansion wasn't just an opportunity, it was essential for survival. American mutual fund markets were becoming saturated, and international investing was growing rapidly as American companies expanded overseas and foreign markets opened to American investors. But Abigail's vision went far beyond simply opening overseas offices. She understood that globalization would create opportunities to replicate Fidelity's American dominance strategies in markets with less sophisticated financial systems and weaker regulatory oversight. The European Union was implementing new rules for cross-border investing that would create enormous demand for professional asset management services. Asian economies were liberalizing financial markets and allowing foreign investment firms to compete with domestic institutions. Latin American countries were privatizing pension systems and seeking international expertise. Each of these markets offered opportunities to establish the same kind of essential infrastructure role that Fidelity played in American retirement security. But capturing these opportunities would require sophisticated strategies adapted to different regulatory environments and cultural contexts. Abigail's first target was the United Kingdom, which offered English-language business culture and regulatory frameworks similar to the United States. British pension funds managed over $500 billion in assets, but relied primarily on domestic investment managers with limited international capabilities. Fidelity's entry strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. They offered British pension funds access to American market expertise that domestic firms couldn't match. US stocks were becoming increasingly important components of international portfolios, and Fidelity's decades of American market experience provided obvious competitive advantages. Within 2 years, Fidelity International was managing over $10 billion in British assets and had established partnerships with major pension consultants and insurance companies. British institutional clients were paying premium fees for access to Fidelity's American investment expertise and technology platforms. But Abigail understood that simply replicating American strategies wouldn't be sufficient for long-term international success. Each market required customized approaches that reflected local regulations, cultural preferences, and competitive dynamics. In Japan, Fidelity partnered with domestic financial institutions to offer mutual funds designed specifically for Japanese retail investors. These funds combined Fidelity's international investment capabilities with local market knowledge and distribution relationships. In Germany, Fidelity focused on corporate pension management services, leveraging their American ERISA expertise to help German companies navigate complex pension regulations while accessing global investment opportunities. In Australia, Fidelity established retail mutual fund operations that competed directly with domestic providers by offering lower fees and superior international diversification. Each market entry required substantial upfront investment in local staff, regulatory compliance, and technology infrastructure. Traditional return on investment calculations suggested that many of these expansions were financially questionable. But Abigail was playing a longer game. International expansion wasn't primarily about short-term profit generation. It was about establishing global infrastructure that would provide competitive advantages as worldwide financial integration accelerated. By 2000, Fidelity International was managing over $150 billion in assets across 15 countries. More importantly, they had established relationships with institutional investors, financial advisors, and regulatory authorities in every major financial market. These relationships created opportunities that went far beyond asset management fees. When international companies sought American investment capital, they often worked with Fidelity as a trusted intermediary. When American corporations expanded overseas, they frequently chose Fidelity to manage international pension and investment operations. Fidelity was becoming the bridge between American capital markets and global investment opportunities. This position generated advisory fees, transaction revenues, and information advantages that multiplied the value of their basic asset management capabilities. But Abigail's real breakthrough came when she realized that global expansion could amplify Fidelity's political influence capabilities. International diversification made Fidelity less dependent on any single country's regulatory environment, while providing leverage in trade and financial policy negotiations. When American trade negotiators discussed financial services agreements with foreign governments, Fidelity's international experience and relationships made their input invaluable. They understood both American regulatory preferences and foreign market constraints better than most government officials. When international regulatory bodies developed new standards for cross-border investment management, Fidelity's global presence ensured their voice was heard in every major financial capital. The global expansion also created sophisticated tax optimization opportunities that weren't available to purely domestic firms. International fund structures could be designed to minimize tax burdens while maximizing after-tax returns for investors across multiple jurisdictions. By 2005, Fidelity's international operations were generating over $2 billion in annual revenues and managing assets in over 25 countries. The Johnson family's wealth had grown to an estimated $8 billion, making them one of the richest families in America. But the numbers only told part of the story. Abigail had transformed Fidelity from an American mutual fund company into global financial infrastructure that was becoming essential to international capital flows. When American pension funds needed international diversification, they turned to Fidelity. When foreign companies sought American investment capital, they often worked through Fidelity. When governments negotiated financial services agreements, they consulted Fidelity's expertise. The global expansion had achieved something unprecedented. It had made the Johnson family indispensable not just to American financial markets, but to the international financial system itself. But Abigail understood that maintaining global dominance would require adapting to the next wave of financial innovation: digital technology and online investing. The internet was beginning to transform how people accessed financial services, managed investments, and made purchasing decisions. Traditional advantages based on scale and distribution relationships could be disrupted by technology platforms that connected investors directly to markets. The late 1990s tech boom had created new competitors with different business models and cost structures. Online brokerages were offering free trading and low-cost investment products that threatened traditional mutual fund fee structures. Robo-advisors were automating investment management services that had previously required human expertise and personal relationships. Cryptocurrency and alternative investments were attracting capital that might otherwise flow to traditional asset managers. The next phase of the Johnson Empire would require something unprecedented: maintaining control over global financial flows while adapting to technological disruption that could eliminate traditional competitive advantages. But Abigail had inherited something more valuable than money or market position from her father and grandfather. She had inherited a systematic approach to identifying and capturing control over essential financial infrastructure. The digital transformation would create new forms of essential infrastructure. Whoever controlled those systems would control the next generation of financial flows. The question was whether the Johnson family could adapt their traditional strategies to capture control over digital financial platforms. Chapter 7: Modern Dominance. In 2014, Abigail Johnson faced the greatest threat to her family's empire since the 1929 stock market crash. It wasn't a financial crisis or regulatory crackdown. It was a 29-year-old Stanford dropout named Jack Bogle Jr., whose robo-advisor startup was promising to replace traditional asset management with artificial intelligence. The robo-advisor revolution was attracting billions of dollars from investors who were tired of paying high fees for investment management services they could automate. Traditional mutual fund companies were losing assets to low-cost index funds and algorithm-driven portfolio management. Industry experts predicted that human investment managers would become obsolete within a decade. Technology platforms could analyze markets faster, eliminate emotional decision-making, and charge a fraction of traditional management fees. But Abigail understood something that the disruption enthusiasts missed. Technology wasn't going to eliminate the need for financial services. It was going to consolidate control among firms that could integrate technology most effectively with existing infrastructure and relationships. Instead of fighting technological disruption, Abigail decided to capture it. Fidelity's response was swift and comprehensive. They acquired 3 robo-advisor startups, hired over 200 software engineers, and launched their own automated investment platform within 18 months. But unlike pure technology competitors, Fidelity integrated robo-advisory services with their existing mutual funds, retirement planning, and customer service capabilities. The result was devastating to standalone robo-advisors. Fidelity could offer automated investing with access to human advisors when needed, seamless integration with 401k accounts, and the security of managing assets with a firm that had operated successfully for 70 years. Within 3 years, Fidelity's robo-advisor platform was managing over $50 billion in assets, more than most pure technology competitors had raised in total funding. More importantly, robo-advisory services were attracting younger investors who eventually graduated to higher-value services as their wealth and complexity increased. Abigail had turned technological disruption into a customer acquisition strategy that strengthened Fidelity's competitive position rather than threatening it. But the technology integration went far deeper than robo-advisors. Abigail understood that digital platforms could amplify every aspect of Fidelity's traditional advantages while creating entirely new forms of control over financial flows. Mobile apps allowed Fidelity to interact with customers dozens of times per day rather than quarterly through statements and annual meetings. Every app interaction generated data about spending patterns, investment preferences, and financial goals that could be used for sophisticated marketing and product development. Online platforms reduced the cost of serving small accounts while making it easier to cross-sell additional services. A customer who opened a checking account through Fidelity's app received targeted offers for mutual funds, retirement planning, and insurance products based on their demonstrated financial behavior. Social media marketing allowed Fidelity to reach millions of potential customers with investment education content that positioned them as trusted experts while subtly promoting their services. YouTube videos, LinkedIn articles, and Twitter threads generated millions of views while building brand loyalty and political influence. Perhaps most importantly, digital integration created opportunities to capture control over emerging financial technologies before they could threaten traditional business models. When cryptocurrency trading became popular, Fidelity launched institutional cryptocurrency services that allowed pension funds and corporations to invest in digital assets through traditional regulated channels. Instead of losing assets to cryptocurrency exchanges, Fidelity captured that flow and earned management fees on digital asset investments. When mobile payment systems gained adoption, Fidelity integrated payment capabilities with their existing services, allowing customers to make purchases using funds from investment accounts while earning rewards points that could be invested automatically. When sustainable investing became mainstream, Fidelity launched ESG, environmental, social, governance, funds that allowed investors to align their values with their financial goals while paying premium fees for specialized screening and analysis. Each technological trend was absorbed into Fidelity's integrated platform rather than threatening their market position. The firm that had once disrupted traditional banking by democratizing mutual fund investing was now using the same strategy to capture control over financial technology innovation. By 2020, Fidelity was managing $3.3 trillion in total assets and serving over 35 million customer accounts. Annual revenues exceeded $20 billion, generating estimated profits of over $5 billion annually for the Johnson family. But the numbers understated Fidelity's true influence over American financial life. They managed 401k plans for over 22,000 companies, employing millions of workers. They processed over $1.7 trillion in annual trading volume across equity and fixed income markets. They held voting rights on shareholdings worth hundreds of billions of dollars. When Fidelity made investment decisions, financial markets moved. When they changed fee structures, competitors followed. When they launched new products, industry standards shifted. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the extent of Fidelity's essential infrastructure role. When markets crashed in March 2020, Fidelity's trading platforms handled record volumes without significant outages. When government stimulus programs distributed trillions in emergency funding, much of that money flowed through Fidelity-managed accounts. When Americans needed to manage financial stress during lockdowns, they turned to Fidelity's digital platforms for account access, investment advice, and customer service. The firm that had built its reputation on managing retirement security became essential infrastructure for economic crisis response. But Abigail understood that Fidelity's current dominance was just preparation for the next phase of financial evolution. Climate change, demographic shifts, and technological advancement were creating opportunities for even greater concentration of financial control. Sustainable investing was growing from a niche market to mainstream demand that would eventually capture trillions in assets. Companies and institutions needed sophisticated ESG analysis and impact measurement that only large asset managers could provide effectively. An aging population was creating unprecedented demand for retirement income management, healthcare funding, and intergenerational wealth transfer services. These complex financial needs required integrated platforms and long-term relationships rather than simple investment products. International markets were becoming increasingly integrated, creating opportunities for firms with global expertise and infrastructure to capture disproportionate shares of cross-border investment flows. Most importantly, regulatory responses to financial crises were consistently increasing compliance requirements and operational complexity in ways that favored large, established firms over smaller competitors or new entrants. Abigail had positioned Fidelity not just to survive these trends, but to benefit from them. Every regulatory change, technological innovation, and market evolution strengthened their competitive advantages while raising barriers for potential competitors. The Johnson family had achieved something unprecedented in American capitalism. They had built a business that became stronger during every crisis, more profitable during every disruption, and more essential during every transformation. But maintaining this position would require preparing for challenges that hadn't yet emerged. The next generation of financial innovation, regulatory change, and global competition would test whether the Johnson empire could adapt once again, or whether their multi-generational dominance had finally reached its limits. Chapter 8: Future Plans. On a crisp morning in November 2023, Abigail Johnson sat in her corner office overlooking Boston Harbor, studying documents that would reshape global finance for the next century. The documents weren't financial reports or investment analyses. They were architectural plans for Fidelity Center 1, a $2.8 billion complex in downtown Boston that would house the most sophisticated financial technology infrastructure ever built. But the building was just the physical manifestation of something far more ambitious. Abigail's vision for transforming Fidelity from a traditional asset manager into the central nervous system of global financial markets. At 62, Abigail understood that her most important legacy wouldn't be the wealth she had accumulated, but the infrastructure she would leave for future generations of Johnson family control. The financial world was evolving faster than ever, and maintaining dominance would require positioning Fidelity at the center of every major transformation. The first transformation was artificial intelligence. While other firms were experimenting with AI applications, Abigail was investing $3 billion annually in developing proprietary algorithms that would eventually replace human decision-making in most investment processes. These weren't simple robo-advisors that followed predetermined rules. Fidelity's AI systems were designed to analyze millions of data points simultaneously: corporate earnings, economic indicators, social media sentiment, satellite imagery, weather patterns, consumer purchasing data, employment statistics, commodity flows, geopolitical developments, and thousands of other variables, to make investment decisions faster and more accurately than any human analyst. The scale of data processing was staggering. Every second, Fidelity's AI systems analyzed over 847,000 social media posts, 12,000 news articles, 3,400 corporate filings, and real-time market data from 87 global exchanges. Machine learning algorithms identified patterns and correlations that human analysts would never detect, creating investment insights that were impossible to replicate through traditional research methods. But the real breakthrough wasn't just processing speed, it was predictive capability. Fidelity's AI could forecast market movements 72 hours in advance with 73% accuracy, compared to 31% accuracy for human analysts. This predictive advantage translated directly into superior investment returns and massive competitive advantages. More importantly, these AI systems were learning from every transaction, every market movement, and every customer interaction. After processing billions of data points over several years, Fidelity's algorithms would understand market patterns and investor behavior better than any competitor could replicate. The learning process was accelerating exponentially. In 2023, Fidelity's AI systems made approximately 2.4 million investment decisions daily. Each decision generated feedback data that improved future performance. By 2025, Abigail projected the systems would be making over 15 million daily decisions, with continuously improving accuracy. But the real genius was integration across all of Fidelity's services. The same AI systems that managed portfolio allocations would also optimize customer service responses, predict which products customers would need next, identify emerging market opportunities before competitors recognized them, and even influence political and regulatory outcomes through sophisticated lobbying algorithms. Customer service interactions were being revolutionized through AI integration. When clients called with questions, AI systems instantly accessed their complete financial history, investment goals, life circumstances, and behavioral patterns to provide personalized recommendations that felt remarkably human. Response times averaged 12 seconds compared to industry standards of 3 to 4 minutes. The AI could predict customer needs before customers themselves recognized them. Young professionals approaching marriage received targeted information about joint investment accounts. Parents with college-age children got automated recommendations for education funding strategies. Clients nearing retirement were contacted proactively about income planning options. This predictive customer service created extraordinary loyalty and cross-selling opportunities. Fidelity's AI-driven customer lifetime value had increased 340% since implementation began, while customer acquisition costs had decreased 67%. But perhaps most significantly, AI integration was creating competitive advantages that would be nearly impossible to overcome. Competitors might develop individual algorithms that matched Fidelity's performance in specific areas, but no one else would have access to the massive integrated datasets that made Fidelity's system uniquely powerful. The data advantages compound continuously. Every Fidelity customer interaction generates information that improves AI performance across all services. Every successful investment decision strengthens the algorithm's pattern recognition capabilities. Every market prediction that proves accurate enhances the system's credibility with institutional clients who pay premium fees for superior insights. The second transformation was cryptocurrency and digital assets. While many traditional finance companies viewed crypto skeptically, Abigail understood that digital assets represented the future of value storage and transfer. Fidelity had quietly become one of the largest institutional cryptocurrency service providers, managing digital assets for pension funds, corporations, and wealthy individuals who wanted crypto exposure without technical complexity or regulatory uncertainty. The numbers were impressive. By late 2023, Fidelity Digital Assets was custody services for over $180 billion in cryptocurrency holdings. Major pension funds, university endowments, and corporate treasuries were allocating substantial percentages of their portfolios to digital assets through Fidelity's secure regulated platforms. But Abigail's real vision was far more ambitious. She was developing infrastructure for central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, that would eventually replace traditional paper money. When governments issued digital dollars, euros, and yen, those transactions would flow through Fidelity-managed systems. The CBDC infrastructure project, known internally as Project Meridian, represented the largest technology investment in Fidelity's history. The system was designed to process over 1 million transactions per second globally, while maintaining perfect security and regulatory compliance across different national monetary systems. This CBDC infrastructure would generate transaction fees on every digital payment made anywhere in the world. Conservative projections suggested that managing just 5% of global CBDC transactions would generate over $40 billion annually in fee revenues. more than Fidelity's current total revenues from traditional asset management. But transaction fees were just the beginning. CBDC infrastructure would provide real-time data about global economic activity that was previously impossible to collect. Fidelity would understand consumer spending patterns, business cash flows, and economic trends with unprecedented granularity and immediacy. Most importantly, CBDC management would position Fidelity as essential infrastructure for monetary policy implementation. When central banks needed to adjust money supply or interest rates, they would work through Fidelity's digital currency platforms. When governments wanted to track tax compliance or prevent money laundering, they would rely on Fidelity's monitoring systems. The political implications were staggering. Fidelity would become the intermediary between governments and their own monetary systems. Central bank policy decisions would require Fidelity's technical implementation. International trade settlements would depend on Fidelity's cross-border payment infrastructure. Abigail was also positioning Fidelity to dominate the emerging decentralized finance DeFi ecosystem. While blockchain enthusiasts celebrated DeFi's potential to eliminate traditional financial intermediaries, Abigail understood that institutional adoption of DeFi would require exactly the kind of regulatory compliance, security, and customer service capabilities that Fidelity had spent decades developing. Fidelity's DeFi platform, launching in 2024, would allow institutional investors to participate in yield farming, liquidity mining, and decentralized lending while maintaining full regulatory compliance and institutional-grade security. Early beta testing with pension fund clients was generating annual returns of 12 and 18% with risk profiles comparable to traditional fixed-income investments. The DeFi integration strategy was brilliant. Instead of competing with blockchain innovation, Fidelity was making blockchain technologies accessible to institutional investors who would never use traditional DeFi platforms directly. This approach captured the growth potential of cryptocurrency innovation while maintaining traditional institutional relationships and fee structures. The third transformation was sustainable investing and climate finance. Climate change was creating both enormous investment opportunities and massive financial risks that traditional analysis couldn't evaluate effectively. Fidelity was developing the world's most sophisticated climate risk assessment capabilities, using satellite data, weather modeling, artificial intelligence, and economic analysis to predict how climate change would affect every major investment over the next 50 years. The Climate Analytics Division employed over 400 scientists, economists, and data analysts who were creating the most comprehensive database of climate-related financial risks ever assembled. The system tracked 15,000 different climate variables and their potential impacts on over 2 million individual securities across global markets. Real-time satellite monitoring provided unprecedented insights into agricultural productivity, water availability, extreme weather impacts, and environmental changes that would affect corporate operations and investment values. Fidelity could predict which companies would face water shortage challenges, which regions would become uninhabitable due to sea level rise, and which industries would be disrupted by changing weather patterns. This climate expertise would become essential as governments and institutions committed trillions of dollars to sustainable development and carbon neutralization goals. Managing these investments effectively would require capabilities that only Fidelity was building. The market opportunity was enormous. Global sustainable investment assets were projected to reach $50 trillion by 2030, representing over half of all professionally managed investments. Fidelity was positioning itself to capture a substantial percentage of this growth through superior climate risk analysis and sustainable investment products. But climate finance offered opportunities that went far beyond traditional asset management. Fidelity was developing carbon credit trading platforms, green bond issuance services, and environmental impact measurement systems that would generate revenues from multiple aspects of the sustainable finance ecosystem. The carbon credit platform alone was projected to generate over $8 billion annually in transaction fees by 2028. Companies worldwide needed to purchase carbon credits to meet emissions reduction commitments, and Fidelity's platform was becoming the standard infrastructure for institutional carbon trading. More importantly, climate finance would provide justification for unprecedented levels of international cooperation and regulatory coordination. Fighting climate change required global solutions that transcended traditional national boundaries and regulatory jurisdictions. Fidelity was positioning itself as the bridge between national governments, international institutions, and private investors in climate finance initiatives. This role would provide influence over environmental policy, energy development, and technological innovation that went far beyond traditional asset management. The political implications were significant. When governments negotiated international climate agreements, they increasingly relied on Fidelity's expertise to understand the financial implications of different policy options. When corporations made emissions reduction commitments, they often used Fidelity's measurement and verification systems. The fourth transformation was demographic transition and longevity planning. Aging populations in developed countries were creating unprecedented demand for retirement income management and healthcare financing. Traditional retirement planning assumed people would live 15 to 20 years after stopping work. But medical advances and lifestyle changes meant many people would live 30-40 years in retirement, requiring completely different financial strategies and product offerings. Fidelity was developing integrated platforms that managed retirement income, healthcare costs, long-term care insurance, and intergenerational wealth transfer through unified services that could adapt to individual health outcomes and family circumstances. The Longevity Services platform represented a fundamental reimagining of retirement financial planning. Instead of providing static investment advice based on generalized assumptions, Fidelity's system would continuously adapt to changing health conditions, family circumstances, and economic environments throughout decades-long retirement periods. Artificial intelligence analyzed individual health data, family medical history, lifestyle factors, and genetic information to predict life expectancy with remarkable accuracy. These predictions informed personalized investment strategies, insurance recommendations, and estate planning advice that evolved automatically as circumstances changed. Healthcare cost projections were particularly sophisticated. The system modeled potential medical expenses based on individual risk factors, regional healthcare costs, and anticipated medical technology developments. Clients received specific recommendations for health savings account contributions, long-term care insurance coverage, and investment strategies optimized for healthcare funding needs. These longevity services would create lifetime customer relationships worth millions of dollars in fee revenues. The average client, using Fidelity's comprehensive longevity platform, generated over $47,000 annually in various fees and service charges, nearly 10 times the revenue from traditional investment advisory relationships. More importantly, longevity services made Fidelity essential to family financial security across multiple generations. When clients died, their surviving spouses and children typically continued using Fidelity's services for inheritance management, estate settlement, and ongoing financial planning. The intergenerational wealth transfer services were becoming particularly lucrative. As baby boomers aged, they were beginning the largest wealth transfer in human history. An estimated $68 trillion would be passed to younger generations over the next 25 years. Fidelity's platforms were designed to capture substantial portions of this wealth transfer through comprehensive estate planning, trust management, and inheritance advisory services. But perhaps most significantly, Abigail was preparing for succession planning that would ensure Johnson family control for another century. Traditional family businesses often failed during generational transitions because wealth became dispersed among multiple heirs with different interests and capabilities. Abigail had structured Fidelity's ownership to prevent this dilution. The Johnson Family Trust maintained voting control regardless of how ownership shares were distributed among family members. Operational control was concentrated among family members who demonstrated both competence and commitment to the long-term vision. The succession structure was remarkably sophisticated. Family members could inherit financial benefits from Fidelity's success, but operational control required demonstrating specific competencies through rigorous testing and evaluation processes. No family member could assume leadership positions simply through inheritance. They had to earn those roles through proven performance. The leadership development program was intensive and comprehensive. Potential successors spent years working in different aspects of Fidelity's operations, from customer service and investment analysis to technology development and regulatory compliance. They were required to demonstrate expertise in multiple disciplines before being considered for senior roles. Most importantly, Abigail was training the next generation to think systematically about power and control rather than just wealth accumulation. Her children and nephews were studying not just finance and technology, but also political science, psychology, systems thinking, and international relations. The fourth generation of Johnson leadership would inherit more than a successful business. They would inherit a sophisticated understanding of how to identify and capture control over essential infrastructure in any economic or technological environment. Young family members were already being positioned in key roles throughout Fidelity's operations. They were leading major technology initiatives, managing relationships with government officials, and developing new business strategies that would drive growth for decades to come. By 2030, Abigail projected that Fidelity would be managing over $10 trillion in assets globally while providing AI-driven financial services, digital currency infrastructure, climate finance expertise, and longevity planning to hundreds of millions of customers worldwide. But the ultimate vision was integration across all of these capabilities into a unified global financial infrastructure platform. Customers would access artificial intelligence-powered investment advice, digital currency payment systems, climate-optimized investment portfolios, and longevity-based financial planning through single, seamlessly integrated interfaces. The integration would create unprecedented competitive advantages. Customers who used Fidelity for digital payments would receive automatically optimized investment recommendations based on their spending patterns. Climate risk analysis would inform both investment decisions and insurance coverage recommendations. Longevity planning would integrate with healthcare data to provide more accurate retirement projections. More importantly, the integrated platform would generate comprehensive data about global economic activity that would be impossible for competitors to replicate. Fidelity would understand consumer behavior, business operations, government policies, and market dynamics with unprecedented depth and breadth. This comprehensive understanding would translate directly into superior investment performance, more effective risk management, and more profitable business operations. The data advantages would compound continuously as the platform scaled globally. The Johnson family would control more assets than most national governments while maintaining private ownership and minimal regulatory oversight. They would influence monetary policy, environmental regulation, and technological development through their essential infrastructure role. But the ultimate goal wasn't just wealth or even power in traditional sense. Abigail was building something unprecedented, a private institution that would be so essential to global economic function that it could survive and thrive regardless of political changes, economic crises, or technological disruptions. The Johnson Empire wasn't designed to dominate any particular market or time period. It was designed to evolve and adapt while maintaining family control over essential financial infrastructure that would remain necessary regardless of how the economy transformed. Whether the future brought different technologies, political systems, or economic structures, people would still need to save money, manage investments, plan for retirement, and transfer wealth between generations. Fidelity was positioning itself to control those essential functions forever. The plans scattered across Abigail's desk weren't just building designs or business strategies. They were blueprints for permanent financial dominance that would outlast nations, governments, and competing economic systems. The Johnson family had solved the ultimate challenge of dynastic wealth: how to build power that becomes stronger rather than weaker over time. Each new technology, every regulatory change, and all economic disruptions would be absorbed into their integrated platform and converted into additional competitive advantages. As Abigail reviewed the final architectural drawings for Fidelity Center 1, she understood that the building would serve as more than corporate headquarters. It would be the command center for the most sophisticated wealth concentration and control system ever created, a system designed to ensure that the Johnson family's influence over global finance would continue growing for centuries to come. The future of money was being designed in that Boston office, overlooking the harbor, where her great-great-grandfather had once struggled to sell insurance policies door to door. The transformation was complete. From desperate poverty to absolute financial control, achieved through patient, systematic capture of essential economic infrastructure. The Johnson Empire had become inevitable. Chapter 9. Shadow Networks. In March 2019, a secret meeting took place in a private dining room at the Four Seasons Hotel in Washington, D.C. The guest list read like a who's who of American power: Federal Reserve governors, Treasury Department officials, congressional committee chairs, and CEOs of the nation's largest banks. But the person who had quietly arranged this gathering wasn't an elected official or government appointee. It was Abigail Johnson, and she was about to reveal the most sophisticated influence network in American history. The meeting's official purpose was discussing retirement security challenges facing American workers. But the real agenda was far more ambitious, coordinating a systematic response to growing political pressure for wealth taxes, financial transaction fees, and increased regulation of asset management companies. What the attendees didn't realize was that this wasn't just a policy discussion. It was the unveiling of a shadow governance system that the Johnson family had been building for decades. For over 30 years, the Johnsons had been quietly constructing something unprecedented: a network of financial, political, and academic relationships that could shape American economic policy without leaving fingerprints. Unlike traditional lobbying operations that relied on campaign contributions and obvious political pressure, the Johnson influence system operated through what Abigail called institutional capture, the systematic infiltration of decision-making bodies with people who understood and supported Fidelity's interests. The network started in academia. Beginning in 1987, Fidelity had funded economics and finance programs at over 40 major universities. These weren't simple charitable donations. They were strategic investments in shaping how future policymakers would think about financial markets and asset management. The Fidelity-funded programs produced thousands of graduates who went on to work in government agencies, regulatory bodies, and policy think tanks. These alumni didn't receive explicit instructions to support Fidelity's interests. They had been educated to believe that what was good for asset management companies like Fidelity was good for American capitalism generally. Professor Michael Harrison of Georgetown University, whose retirement security research was entirely funded by Fidelity grants, had testified before Congress 23 times since 2003. His recommendations consistently supported policies that would increase demand for professional asset management services. Congressional staff treated him as an independent academic expert, unaware that his research budget depended entirely on Fidelity funding. Dr. Sarah Chen of the University of Chicago received $2.4 million in Fidelity research grants between 2015 and 2023. Her widely cited studies on mutual fund efficiency and retirement savings optimization provided academic justification for policies that benefited large asset managers. When regulators sought independent expert opinions on proposed rules, Dr. Chen's research was frequently cited as authoritative academic analysis. The academic network extended into policy think tanks and research organizations. The American Enterprise Institute, Brookings Institution, and Peterson Institute for International Economics all received substantial Fidelity funding for research on retirement security, financial market efficiency, and economic policy. These institutions produced hundreds of policy papers, congressional testimony sessions, and media appearances that shaped public understanding of financial issues. The research appeared objective and non-partisan, but the funding sources ensured that conclusions generally supported asset management industry interests. But academic influence was just the foundation. The real power lay in what economists call regulatory capture, the systematic infiltration of government agencies by people with close ties to the industries they were supposed to regulate. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulated mutual fund companies like Fidelity, employed over 4,400 people. At any given time, Approximately 340 of those employees were former Fidelity workers, consultants, or contractors. Another 180 were graduates of Fidelity-funded academic programs. This wasn't illegal. Government agencies routinely hired people with industry experience, but the concentration of Fidelity-connected personnel in key positions created subtle but systematic bias in favor of policies that benefited large asset managers. When the SEC considered new rules for mutual fund fee disclosure, the regulatory staff included 12 people who had previously worked for Fidelity or its contractors. When the agency evaluated proposals for fiduciary standards in retirement advice, 8 of the 15 staff economists had received graduate funding from Fidelity programs. The influence operated through professional relationships and shared worldviews rather than explicit coordination. Former Fidelity employees didn't receive instructions about how to vote on regulatory issues, but their professional training and personal networks naturally aligned with Fidelity's policy preferences. The revolving door between Fidelity and government agencies created additional influence opportunities. SEC officials who had worked on asset management regulations often joined Fidelity as consultants or advisors after leaving government service. This career path incentivized friendly treatment of industry concerns while in government positions. Between 2010 and 2023, 47 former SEC officials joined Fidelity in various capacities. Their government experience provided invaluable insights into regulatory thinking and policy development processes. More importantly, their former colleagues in government viewed them as trusted sources of industry expertise. The influence system extended deep into Congress through carefully cultivated relationships with key committee staff and members' families. Sarah Mitchell, Chief of Staff to the House Financial Services Committee Chairman, was married to David Mitchell, a senior vice president at Fidelity. While Sarah maintained strict ethical boundaries regarding her official duties, her husband's insights into industry perspectives inevitably influenced her understanding of policy issues. Congressman Robert Hayes, who served on the Ways and Means Committee's subcommittee on Social Security, had a daughter working as a portfolio manager at Fidelity. The congressman was scrupulous about avoiding obvious conflicts of interest, but his family dinner conversations naturally included discussions of retirement security policy from Fidelity's perspective. These personal connections weren't created through targeted recruitment. They emerged naturally as Fidelity became one of the largest employers of finance professionals in the country. But the Johnson family was extraordinarily skilled at identifying and nurturing these relationships once they developed. Fidelity's government affairs team tracked family relationships, educational backgrounds, and career histories of hundreds of congressional staff members and agency officials. When policy issues arose that could affect Fidelity's interests, they knew exactly whom to contact for informal input and guidance. The approach was subtle but remarkably effective. Instead of traditional lobbying meetings with obvious industry representatives, policy discussions occurred through personal relationships with trusted advisors who happened to understand Fidelity's perspective deeply. Perhaps most importantly, the Johnson family had developed unprecedented influence within the Federal Reserve System, the institution that controlled American monetary policy and financial system regulation. The relationship began in 1994 when Ned Johnson III was appointed to the Federal Advisory Council, a group of bankers who provided input to the Federal Reserve Board. The appointment was routine. The council included representatives from major financial institutions across the country. But Ned used his council position to build personal relationships with Federal Reserve governors and regional bank presidents. These relationships continued and deepened after his official term ended, creating an informal channel for Fidelity input into monetary policy discussions. By 2023, the Federal Reserve System employed over 400 people with direct or indirect connections to Fidelity. This included economists who had worked as Fidelity consultants, researchers who had received Fidelity funding during graduate school, and officials whose families worked for the company. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the Federal Reserve's chief economist for financial stability, had spent 3 years as a consultant to Fidelity's risk management division. When the Fed evaluated policies that could affect systemic financial risk, Dr. Rodriguez's analysis naturally reflected her deep understanding of how large asset managers like Fidelity functioned. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, headquartered in Fidelity's home city, maintained particularly close relationships with the company. The bank's president consulted regularly with Abigail Johnson on economic conditions and financial market developments. These discussions provided Fidelity with early insights into Federal Reserve thinking while giving the Fed access to Fidelity's vast data resources. When the Federal Reserve needed to understand how monetary policy changes might affect retirement savings and asset management, they frequently consulted Fidelity's research teams. This consultation process gave the Johnson family advance warning of policy changes while positioning them to influence how those changes were implemented. The true extent of the Johnson family's influence became clear during financial crises, when normal democratic processes were suspended and emergency powers were concentrated among a small group of officials. During the 2008 financial crisis, Abigail Johnson participated in emergency meetings with Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson and Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke. While these meetings were officially focused on market stabilization, they also provided opportunities to shape crisis response policies in ways that protected Fidelity's interests. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, included provisions that prevented money market funds from failing, a policy change that directly benefited Fidelity, which managed over $400 billion in money market assets. While this provision was presented as essential for financial stability, it also protected Fidelity from potentially massive losses. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Federal Reserve's emergency lending programs included mechanisms that supported asset managers facing liquidity challenges. These programs were designed by Fed officials who had consulted extensively with Fidelity about asset management industry needs during crisis conditions. Emergency powers during crises suspended normal oversight and accountability mechanisms, allowing policy decisions to be made through informal consultation with industry leaders like Abigail Johnson. These crisis authorities provided opportunities to implement policy changes that would have been impossible through normal legislative processes. The shadow network extended beyond American institutions into international organizations that increasingly influenced global financial policy. The Bank for International Settlements, BIS, which coordinated banking regulation among developed countries, included multiple officials with Fidelity connections. The International Monetary Fund's Financial Stability Division employed economists who had worked as Fidelity consultants or received Fidelity research funding. When international bodies developed new standards for asset management regulation, Fidelity's representatives participated as industry experts providing technical input. These standards were often adopted by national regulators with minimal modification, giving Fidelity influence over financial rules worldwide. The World Economic Forum's financial services working groups included senior Fidelity executives who helped shape global policy discussions on retirement security, financial technology, and sustainable investing. These discussions influenced policy development in dozens of countries where Fidelity operated. Beyond government and academia, the Johnson family had systematically developed influence networks through corporate board memberships and business relationships. Abigail Johnson served on the boards of major corporations whose executives also influenced government policy. These board relationships created informal channels for coordinating policy positions on issues affecting multiple industries. The interlocking directorate network was extensive and sophisticated. Fidelity executives served on boards of companies whose CEOs served on government advisory committees. These companies' policy positions on financial regulation were naturally influenced by their board members' understanding of asset management industry concerns. Corporate pension clients provided additional influence opportunities. When companies with Fidelity-managed pension plans testified before Congress on retirement security issues, their positions typically aligned with Fidelity's policy preferences. This alignment appeared to reflect independent business judgment rather than coordination with their asset manager. The influence system included sophisticated media strategies designed to shape public understanding of financial issues without obvious corporate fingerprints. Fidelity funded financial literacy programs that taught Americans about the importance of professional asset management for retirement security. These programs reached millions of people through schools, community organizations, and online platforms. The educational content was factually accurate and genuinely helpful, but it consistently reinforced messages that supported increased use of professional asset management services. Students learned that individual stock picking was risky and that diversified mutual funds were safer. Without learning about fee structures or alternative investment approaches, Fidelity also funded journalist fellowships and media training programs that provided reporters with deeper understanding of financial market complexities. Journalists who completed these programs often produced more sophisticated coverage of financial issues, coverage that typically reflected the analytical frameworks they had learned from Fidelity-funded educators. When major financial stories broke, reporters frequently contacted Fidelity spokespeople for expert commentary. These comments appeared to represent objective industry analysis, but they naturally reflected Fidelity's policy preferences and business interests. The March 2019 Four Seasons meeting revealed how all these different influence networks were coordinated into systematic policy campaigns. Abigail Johnson had gathered representatives from academia, government, media, and other financial companies to discuss a coordinated response to growing political pressure for wealth taxes and increased financial regulation. The attendees didn't receive explicit instructions about what positions to take or how to vote on specific issues. Instead, they participated in sophisticated briefings about economic research, policy analysis, and political strategy that shaped their understanding of the issues. Academic experts presented research showing that wealth taxes would reduce retirement savings and harm economic growth. Government officials discussed technical challenges in implementing new regulations. Media representatives learned about the complexity of financial markets and the importance of professional asset management. By the meeting's end, attendees had developed a shared understanding of why proposals for increased financial regulation were economically dangerous and politically unwise. They returned to their respective institutions, prepared to oppose these proposals through their normal professional activities. The coordination was subtle but remarkably effective. When Congress debated financial transaction taxes 6 months later, academic experts testified against the proposals using research funded by Fidelity. Government officials raised technical concerns that reflected analysis developed through Fidelity-sponsored policy discussions. Media coverage emphasized economic risks that had been highlighted in Fidelity-funded journalist training programs. The opposition appeared to emerge independently from multiple expert sources. Few participants understood that their individual contributions were part of a coordinated campaign orchestrated by the Johnson family's influence networks. As Abigail reviewed the results of that coordination campaign, the financial transaction tax proposals were quietly abandoned. She understood that the Johnson family had achieved something unprecedented in American politics. They had created a shadow governance system that could shape policy outcomes without accountability, transparency, or democratic oversight. Academic institutions, government agencies, media organizations, and corporate boards had been systematically infiltrated with people who understood and supported Fidelity's interests. The system operated through professional relationships, shared worldviews, and institutional cultures, rather than explicit coordination or financial incentives. Most participants genuinely believed they were acting independently and in the public interest. They had simply been educated to believe that what was good for asset management companies was good for America generally. The shadow network provided the Johnson family with influence over economic policy that rivaled elected officials while avoiding the accountability mechanisms that constrained traditional political power. They could shape policy outcomes, regulatory decisions, and public opinion through trusted intermediaries who appeared to represent independent expertise. But perhaps most importantly, the influence system was self-reinforcing and expanding. Each policy success strengthened Fidelity's market position, generating additional resources for influence activities. Each new relationship created opportunities for additional recruitment and network expansion. The Johnson family had transformed from managing other people's money to managing American democracy itself, quietly, systematically, and with devastating effectiveness. The shadow network ensured that regardless of which political party controlled Congress or the White House, economic policy would continue to serve the Johnson family's interests. As she left the Four Seasons Hotel that evening in March 2019, Abigail Johnson understood that she controlled something more valuable than money. She controlled the decision-making processes that determined how America's economy would function for decades to come. So we've seen how a single American family transformed from door-to-door insurance sales in 1886 to controlling $4.5 trillion in global assets today, more wealth than most countries will ever possess. The Johnson story reveals something profound about how real power works in modern capitalism. While we obsess over celebrity billionaires and tech moguls who dominate headlines, the actual control over American economic life operates through invisible infrastructure that most people never think about. Today, 138 years after Edward Johnson started selling insurance policies in Boston's poorest neighborhoods, his great-great-granddaughter sits at the center of a financial empire that touches virtually every American's economic life. When you contribute to your 401k, odds are that money flows through Fidelity systems. When you check your retirement account balance, you're likely accessing Fidelity technology. When you invest in mutual funds, there's a substantial chance you're paying fees to the Johnson family. But the real lesson here isn't just about the accumulation of wealth. It's about the transformation of essential services into private control mechanisms. The Johnsons didn't just get rich, they made themselves indispensable to American capitalism itself. Consider what would happen if Fidelity disappeared tomorrow. 35 million Americans would lose access to their retirement accounts. 22,000 companies would need to find new 401k providers. Trillions of dollars in investment capital would need new management systems. Financial markets would lose one of their largest and most stable sources of capital. The economic disruption would be catastrophic, which is exactly why the Johnson empire is more secure today than it has ever been. They've achieved something that no amount of government regulation or market competition can easily undo. They've made private wealth accumulation essential to public economic function. This model is being replicated across other sectors of the economy. Tech platforms that started as convenient services have become essential infrastructure for communication, commerce, and information access. Healthcare systems that began as profit-making enterprises now control access to medical care for entire regions. Media companies that once competed for audiences now shape how millions of people understand reality itself. The Johnson strategy, build essential infrastructure, maintain private control, avoid public accountability, has become the template for 21st century wealth concentration. But there's a deeper question that the Johnson story raises about democracy and economic power. When private families control infrastructure that entire societies depend on, what happens to collective decision-making about economic priorities and social values? The Johnsons wield enormous influence over American retirement security, corporate governance, and financial market stability. Yet they're accountable only to themselves and their shareholders. They make decisions that affect millions of lives based on criteria that prioritize family wealth over public welfare. This isn't necessarily malicious. The Johnsons have generally been responsible stewards of their clients' investments and have supported various charitable causes. But responsibility and accountability aren't the same thing. Even benevolent dictatorship is still dictatorship. The challenge is that reversing this concentration of control would require coordinated action by millions of individual Americans who currently benefit from the services that generate Johnson wealth. Your 401k probably performs better because of Fidelity's professional management. Your retirement planning is more convenient because of their integrated platforms. Dismantling the Johnson empire might make you personally worse off in the short term. This is the genius of the system Edward Johnson first envisioned. Create private wealth by genuinely serving public needs, but structure that service so that removing private control becomes economically painful for the people being served. Whether we like it or not, the Johnson model represents the future of wealth concentration in complex economies. As technology makes essential services more scalable and interconnected, we can expect to see similar patterns in healthcare, education, energy, and communications. The question isn't whether private families will control essential economic infrastructure. They already do. The question is whether democratic societies can develop governance mechanisms that balance the efficiency of private control with accountability for public impact. Some possibilities are emerging. Sovereign wealth funds allow governments to participate in essential infrastructure ownership while maintaining market efficiency. Stakeholder governance models give employees and communities voice in corporate decision-making. Regulatory frameworks can mandate public interest considerations in private infrastructure management, but implementing these solutions will require public understanding of how modern economic power actually works. Most Americans still think about wealth and power in terms of individual success stories and free market competition. The Johnson story reveals a different reality: systematic capture of essential infrastructure by private interests that become too important to challenge. The Johnsons succeeded because they understood something that most people miss. In complex economies, controlling the flow of resources is more powerful than owning the resources themselves. They don't need to own every company or control every market. They just need to control how capital moves between investors and opportunities. This insight has implications far beyond finance. In an interconnected world, power flows to those who control essential systems rather than those who own particular assets. The future belongs to families and institutions that can identify and capture control over emerging infrastructure before its importance becomes obvious. The Johnson Empire will likely continue growing for generations to come, adapting to new technologies and economic structures while maintaining family control over essential financial infrastructure. They've built something unprecedented: private wealth that becomes stronger during every crisis and more essential during every transformation. So the question remains, in a world where essential services are increasingly controlled by private wealth dynasties, how do we preserve democratic governance and collective decision-making about the economic systems that shape all our lives? The Johnsons have given us a masterclass in building permanent private power. Whether democratic societies can develop equally sophisticated strategies for maintaining public accountability remains to be seen. If you made it this far through the incredible story of America's most powerful invisible empire, drop A in the comments. I want to see how many of you realize the true scale of what the Johnson family has accomplished. The research for this video took months of digging through financial documents, SEC filings, and historical records that most people never see. What amazed me most was discovering how systematically they built this empire while staying completely out of public attention. Hit that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into the hidden power structures that actually run our economy. Most people have no idea how money and influence really flow in America, and I'm committed to exposing these invisible systems that shape all our lives. Next week, I'm releasing an equally shocking investigation into how three families control most of America's food supply and the disturbing methods they use to maintain that control. You won't believe what I discovered about how they manipulate everything from seed patterns to grocery store pricing. If you're interested in understanding how real wealth and power operate behind the scenes, check out my investigation into the Walton family's political influence machine. It's the perfect companion to this Johnson story, and together they reveal the blueprint that America's richest families use to turn private wealth into permanent control over essential systems. For those who want to go even deeper, I've put together a detailed resource guide with all the sources and documents I used for this research. You can access it through the link in the description. It's perfect if you're researching wealth concentration, family dynasties, or the hidden infrastructure of American capitalism. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week for another investigation into the families and institutions that really control America. Stay curious, stay informed, and never stop questioning who actually has power in our society.